His family forced his black wife to eat in the kitchen. The Korean Mafia boss was already at the door. The rain over Busan had been falling since noon, and by the time the harbor lights came on, the Han family's hillside house looked like something carved out of the storm itself, glass and dark stone, floodlit against the water below. Ngozi Adeyemi stood in the upstairs hallway in a navy wrap dress she'd chosen with more care than she wanted to admit, and listened to laughter rising from the dining room 2 floors down. She'd learned, in 18 months of marriage into this family, to read a room by its sound alone before she ever walked into it. Tonight the laughter had an edge she didn't like. Too bright. Too rehearsed. She went down anyway. The dining room doors were open, and warmth spilled out of them. Candlelight, the smell of grilled short rib, a long table set for 14. Han Suja sat at its head in charcoal silk, a woman built the way certain buildings are built, nothing decorative, everything load-bearing. She looked up when Ngozi crossed the threshold, and the laughter thinned like smoke finding a window. Ngozi. Suja set down her spoon with a small, precise click. Tonight is a shareholders' dinner. Family and board members only. I am family. Board members, Suja repeated, as though the word answered everything. A man at the far end, Baek Jin-sung, Suja's younger brother, broad through the shoulders, a smile permanently arranged on his face like furniture nobody had asked for, didn't bother lowering his voice. She wants to sit with grown-ups discussing the company. Let her eat in the kitchen. It's warmer there anyway. He didn't look at her once while he said it. Men who speak about you instead of to you are always more dangerous than the ones who insult you directly. Ngozi had learned that in board rooms years before she ever set foot in this house. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She picked up the plate a staff member had already begun clearing from the place setting that had, until 30 seconds ago, been hers, jollof rice she'd cooked herself that afternoon, the only thing on the table that hadn't come from a caterer. And she carried it out through the swinging service door into the pantry. If you were standing in that doorway, would you have said something, or gone quiet like everyone else at that table? Tell me honestly, because I want to know what you'd have done before I tell you what she did. The pantry was narrow, fluorescent lit, lined with steel shelving and the hum of a walk-in refrigerator. Ngozi set the plate on a prep counter, pulled out a stool, and sat down to eat alone in a $12 million house, the way she had eaten alone plenty of times before this family existed in her life, at construction sites in Houston where she'd been the only woman and the only black engineer on a crew of 40, at conference tables where her calculations were double-checked by men with half her credentials. She knew the particular discipline required to eat a meal with your spine straight while your face gives nothing away. She was on her second bite when Mrs. Yoon, the housekeeper, slipped through the door and closed it softly behind her. You shouldn't be alone tonight, Mrs. Yoon said. Her English was careful, low. There are things I should have told you months ago. She had met him 18 months before that dinner, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a Houston engineering firm, and neither of them had known, in that first hour, that the meeting would end in a marriage. Ngozi had been the lead structural reviewer on a joint venture between her firm and a Korean shipping conglomerate looking to expand a terminal outside Busan. Song Hae-jun had walked in 20 minutes late, in a gray suit that had clearly survived a Trans-Pacific flight badly, and had said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes of the presentation. She'd assumed, the way she'd learned to assume about quiet men in expensive suits, that he wasn't really listening. Then she'd reached the load calculations for the crane foundations, and he'd asked a single question. Not about the numbers, but about the assumption behind them, the soil compaction rate she'd used for the harbor fill, that told her, instantly, he understood the mathematics better than 2 of the men in the room who'd been introduced as engineers. You read the geotechnical appendix, she said, surprised into bluntness. I read everything I signed my name to, he said. It's a habit that's kept me alive more than once. She hadn't understood, then, how literally he meant that. What followed wasn't a whirlwind. It was coffee twice a month whenever his work brought him through Houston, 3 years of careful, unhurried correspondence, technical questions about port infrastructure that slowly, without either of them quite marking the moment, became questions about her family, her mother's health, the ache in her knees from 12 years on construction sites in steel-toed boots. He never once mentioned the parts of his business that lived in shadow. She didn't ask, not because she was naive, but because she'd decided, watching how carefully he moved through every room he entered, that whatever he was protecting her from was something he intended to actually protect her from, not merely hide. He told her the truth eventually, on a bench outside a Busan hospital, the night his father died. Not the sanitized version, the whole of it, the name Han Maritime carried in certain rooms and the reasons for that. She'd sat with the information for 3 days before she called him back. "Why did you wait 3 days?" he'd asked, when she finally did. "Because I wasn't deciding whether I could love you," she'd said. "I already knew that answer. I was deciding whether I could survive what loving you would cost. I needed to be honest with myself about the difference." He had married her 9 months later in a small ceremony neither his mother nor his uncle had fully approved of, and had spent every day since trying, imperfectly, to build the kind of life he'd promised her on that bench. One where the shadow parts of the business got smaller instead of larger, one contract at a time. It was slower than either of them wanted. It had cost him relationships inside his own family that had never fully recovered. And it was, on the night of that dinner 18 months later, still very much unfinished business. She thought about all of that, sitting on the pantry stool with a plate of her grandmother's rice going cold in front of her, and she thought, "This is the cost he warned me about. I knew it was coming. I just didn't know it would look like this." What Mrs. Yoon told her, over the next 15 minutes, was not a single secret but a slow avalanche. The dinner invitations Ngozi had never received, because someone had been intercepting the household mail. The engineering consultancy Ngozi ran on the side, 3 contracts, all inspection work for the Busan Newport terminal expansion, quietly undermined by a rumor campaign suggesting she'd married into the Han name for money and access. The emergency that had called her husband away to Seoul that very afternoon, a supposed crisis at a subsidiary office that Mrs. Yoon did not believe was real. "Who arranged it?" Ngozi asked. Mrs. Yoon's eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward the dining room. Something cold moved through Ngozi's chest, not fear exactly. Recognition. The specific feeling of scattered facts locking suddenly into a shape. She was still sitting with that feeling when headlights swept the courtyard through the pantry's high window. Not the caterer's van. The white sedan with reinforced glass that belonged to her husband. Song Hae-jun was not supposed to be home for 3 more hours. Ngozi's second reaction, hard on the heels of relief, was dread. If Mrs. Yoon was right, and tonight had been arranged to get him out of the house, then his early return meant something had already gone wrong for the people who'd planned it. And people whose plans fail rarely respond gently. She was already moving toward the pantry's side door when she heard his voice through the wall, low and utterly controlled. The voice she'd learned, in a year and a half of marriage, meant he had already stopped being angry and arrived somewhere colder and more absolute. "Don't touch your phones. Nobody leaves this room." The pantry door opened. Hae-jun stood in it, still in his overcoat, rain in his hair, a shallow cut healing above one eyebrow that hadn't been there that morning. His eyes went to the plate on the counter, the spoon beside it, and something crossed his face too large for one expression to hold. Before it vanished, replaced by the stillness that frightened people far more than shouting ever could. He crossed the room. He picked up the plate with both hands, carefully, the way you carry something that matters. He walked back through the swinging door, straight down the center of the dining room, past his mother, past his uncle's dying smile, and set the plate down at the head of the table, his own seat. He pulled out the chair. "Sit," he said quietly, to his wife, in front of everyone. "Tonight this family is going to learn exactly who belongs at this table." Nobody in the room breathed loudly enough to be heard over the rain. Hae-jun didn't sit at the head. He pulled a chair in beside Ngozi instead and lifted the lid off her dish himself, and the smell of it, ginger, tomato, smoked paprika, something entirely unlike anything that had been served that night, moved through the room like an accusation. "The Seoul meeting," he said, to no one in particular. "Cancelled. The contact never showed. 11 years, and he's never once missed an appointment." He looked down the table. "Strange, isn't it?" Baek Jin-sung reached for his water glass with theatrical calm. "How would either of us know anything about your business meetings, nephew?" "That's been true," Hae-jun said, "until recently." He didn't raise his voice once through what came next. The questions about who had scheduled tonight's dinner, who had confirmed the security rotation with Choi Tae-yong, who had asked, for the first time in 6 years, which route Hae-jun's car would take to Seoul. Each question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Ngozi watched the ripples cross faces around the table, her mother-in-law's mouth tightening at the corners. A young man 3 seats down, Jang Min-ho, Hae-jun's cousin, going very still in the particular way of someone realizing the ground beneath him has already given way. Would you trust a family like this again after a night like this one, or would you keep walking and never look back? I want to know, because we're only getting started. It was Choi Tae-yong, Hae-jun's head of security, who came through the door next without knocking, and whose single glance at Hae-jun changed the temperature of the room entirely. Phones, Hae-jun said. On the table. Face down. Now. What Mrs. Yoon brought in 10 minutes later, a folder, not envelopes, retrieved from a locked cabinet in the estate's second office, the one that had been reassigned after Ngozi's assistant had abruptly resigned 6 weeks into the job, was worse than anything Ngozi had braced herself for. Inside were photocopied inspection certificates for the crane systems at Terminal 4 of the Busan Newport expansion. Structural load certifications. Her signature was on every one of them. She hadn't signed a single page in that folder. These are forgeries, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. They're very good forgeries, Hae-jun said, reading the top sheet, his jaw working the way it worked when he was holding something enormous behind a closed door. Good enough that Terminal 4's cranes have been certified safe for 8 months under your name, while carrying loads that were never inspected at all. He looked at his uncle. You've been moving something through those cranes, haven't you? Something that needed a licensed engineer's signature and couldn't get one honestly. Baek Jin-sung's smile, for the first time all evening, did not quite hold its shape. I have protected this family's interests for 30 years, he said. Before you were old enough to understand what protecting something costs. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. What Jin-sung didn't say. What Ngozi would only learn weeks later, from a detective's careful summary of a financial trail 30 years deep, was that he had built the entire smuggling network as a young man, back when Han Maritime's legitimate shipping business had nearly collapsed under a recession that swallowed half the port operators in the city. He had saved the company once, in a manner nobody in polite conversation ever thanked him for, and he had spent every year since believing that debt entitled him to a permanent, unquestioned seat at its center. Hae-jun's slow, careful campaign to wind the shadow business down, one clean contract at a time, one legitimate certification at a time, didn't read to Jin-sung as progress. It read as erasure. A nephew dismantling, piece by piece, the only thing his uncle had ever built that mattered, and replacing it with a version of the family that had no room left for the man who'd kept it alive when it was young and desperate. It didn't excuse what he'd done. Ngozi understood, watching him across that table, that very few things ever did. But she filed the shape of it away all the same, because she had learned, in engineering and in marriage both, that you couldn't reinforce a structure you didn't first understand the true load on. Jang Min-ho pushed his chair back. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a person moves when they've finally decided something. I need some air. Sit down, Choi Tae-yong said. Min-ho looked at his cousin across the table, and something in his face had gone past performance entirely. I'm sorry, Hae-jun. I mean that. Nobody apologizes in advance, Ngozi thought, unless they already know exactly what's coming. The estate lost power all at once, not a flicker, not a brownout, but every light dying in the same second, the specific and total darkness of someone cutting a line deliberately. Emergency lighting kicked in 4 seconds later, a low red wash that turned the long dining table into something out of a fever. In that light, Jin-sung was the only person at the table who hadn't flinched. You should know, he said, folding his hands with the calm of a man arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for a very long time, that they're not here to hurt anyone. They're here to hold the estate until the transfer paperwork can be processed. The port contracts, the terminal license, the board proxies I've been collecting for 11 months, by morning, all of it changes hands. Outside, past the tall windows, a sound moved through the rain that was not thunder. Boots on wet stone. Fast, coordinated, close. Jun was already up, already pulling Ngozi behind the reinforced stone pillar near the far wall, not gently, but with the specific grip of a man who has no time to be gentle and knows exactly the difference between that and cruelty. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'm not going anywhere behind you," she said, and something in his face recalibrated in real time, the look of a man updating an old assumption against new evidence. The first gunshot cracked across the courtyard 4 seconds later. Choi Taeyong's voice on the radio was clipped, professional, and carrying more fear than his tone let through. "West gates breached. 6, maybe 8 men. They cut the backup generator feed on their way in. They knew exactly where it was." That detail landed on Ngozi like a stone. The backup generator's location wasn't public information. It was in exactly one document, the structural survey she'd personally completed for the estate's insurance renewal, 8 months ago, filed in exactly one office. The office that had been broken into. The office her forged certificates had come from. Someone had been reading her files for a very long time. "There's a service corridor," she said, before she'd fully finished the thought. "Behind the wine cellar. It runs under the east wing to the loading dock. I mapped it during the insurance survey. It's not on any building plan the family uses, because it predates the last renovation by 30 years. Jun looked at her. "You're sure?" "I measured it myself. Twice." Taeyong was already moving. "Get the guests down there. Ngozi leads. I'll hold the east corridor as long as I can." "Not the loading dock," Ngozi said suddenly, her stomach dropping. "If they've read my files, they'll know about the loading dock too. It's in the same survey." The room went silent except for the rain and, somewhere below them, another burst of gunfire, closer now. "Then we need a route that isn't in that survey," Jun said. Ngozi closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds she rebuilt the entire house from memory. Not the survey she'd filed, but the actual building, the one only she had walked with her own hands on every wall, the freight elevator she'd used to move sample equipment during her first inspection of the property, before the insurance survey, before any of it had been written down anywhere at all. "There's a freight elevator," she said. "Kitchen sublevel to the roof helipad. I used it for equipment during my first walkthrough, before I ever filed paperwork on this house. It's not documented anywhere. Not even in my own reports." Jun almost smiled. "It was there and gone in under a second. Then that's our way out. If you've made it this far, you already know she's not going to be the one who needs saving tonight. Let me know in one word what you think happens next." Getting 14 frightened guests through a freight elevator built for machinery, not people, took 12 minutes that felt like an hour. Ngozi went first, then guided each person through by voice, by touch, by the particular calm she'd learned on construction sites where panic got people killed faster than falling steel ever did. Taeyong came last, blood soaking through his shoulder from a graze he hadn't mentioned to anyone, and sealed the elevator behind them. On the roof, rain lashing sideways, an elderly board member in a soaked tuxedo jacket froze at the top of the elevator's shaft, staring at the drop below, and Ngozi crouched beside him with her hand flat against his back, the way she used to steady nervous interns on their first site walk 40 stories up. "You've stood on scaffolding before," she said, guessing, because the calluses on his hands told her he hadn't spent his whole life in boardrooms. 40 years ago. Shipyards." His voice shook. "Then your body already knows how to do this. I just need your mind to get out of the way and let it." She held his eyes until his breathing slowed. "One hand at a time. I'm right here." He went. She looked at the helipad's perimeter fence and did the math she'd done in her head 100 times without ever expecting to need it. A maintenance ladder, original to the building, ran down the north face to the generator yard. The one section of the property the attackers hadn't reached, because it sat behind the very fence her forged safety certificates were supposed to have obscured. "One at a time," she told the guests. "Hands here and here. Don't look down, look at the wall." She went down last after Taeyong, her palms raw, her knee screaming from a fall on the wet tile nobody had time to acknowledge, and by the time her feet hit solid ground, sirens were already threading through the rain in the distance. But Hae-jun wasn't with them. He'd gone the other way, toward the estate security office, where the only real evidence that could end this in one motion was sitting on a hard drive nobody outside the family knew existed, the estate's internal recording system, running on its own isolated power circuit, capturing every word spoken in that dining room since the lights went out. Ngozi didn't think about it. She simply turned and went back in through the generator yard's access door, ignoring Taeyong's shout behind her, because she was the only person alive who knew that the security office's emergency lock could be bypassed from a maintenance panel she'd installed herself as a redundancy during the last renovation, a detail that existed in no file, no survey, no document any forger could have stolen, because she'd never written it down anywhere at all. She found Hae-jun already inside, blood on his knuckles, the recording system's transfer bar crawling toward completion at 80%. "You should be on the roof," he said, without looking away from the screen. "You should know by now that's not how this works." 94%. The door handle behind them turned, slow, deliberate, the turn of someone trying not to be heard. Baek Jin-sung stood in the doorway, no guards left beside him, his composure finally, entirely gone. "Stop it," he said. His voice had dropped every performance it had carried all night. "Stop it, or I'll stop it myself." "The system needs a manual override," Ngozi said, standing between him and the console, "and it's on the far side of that server rack. You won't reach it before this finishes." He crossed the room faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and grabbed her wrist, hard enough to bruise, hard enough that she felt it in her teeth. And she let him pull her off balance because her other hand was already closing on the fire suppression control she'd clocked the second she walked into the room, old habit, the habit of an engineer who reads every exit in every space she enters. She hit it. Dense white vapor exploded through the corridor outside, swallowing sound, swallowing sight, swallowing the last of whatever advantage Jin-sung thought he still had. Transfer complete lit the screen in green. Jin-sung's hand, reaching for the keyboard, closed on nothing at all. By the time Hae-jun reached the doorway with Taeyong and two officers a half step behind him, it was already, in every way that mattered, over. The transfer had gone to 3 places at once. Hae-jun's compliance attorney, Marcus Reed, whose firm had spent 3 years quietly walking Han Maritime away from the parts of its business that had never belonged in daylight. The direct line of Detective Ryan Cooper, who had been building a customs fraud case against a smuggling network operating out of 3 Busan port terminals for the better part of a year and had never had the one piece of audio that tied a name to the operation, and a third address Ngozi had entered into the system 11 months earlier, the day she filed her original survey, without telling anyone at all. "Who's the third contact?" Hae-jun asked her later, in the corridor, sirens washing red and blue across the walls. "A journalist," Ngozi said. "Rachel Adams. She's been covering port fraud cases in this city for 2 years. I found her reporting the week I started noticing my inspection files kept going missing. I didn't know what I'd need her for yet. I just knew I wanted a way to call for help that nobody in this house could intercept." Hae-jun looked at her for a long moment, rain-soaked, exhausted, something moving across his face that had nothing to do with strategy at all. "You've been quietly building an emergency exit out of this family for almost a year," he said. "I've been building a foundation," she said. "There's a difference. One is about leaving. The other is about being able to stay without it costing me everything." The formal accounting took 11 weeks. Baek Jin-sung was charged with fraud, forgery, orchestrating an armed breach, and conspiracy to traffic undeclared cargo through certified port infrastructure, 6 counts in total, filed by Detective Cooper's task force with help from documentation Marcus Reed's firm had spent years quietly assembling in the background, unbeknownst to the family whose business it concerned. Jang Min-ho cooperated fully, 7 hours of recorded testimony that named every account, every falsified signature, every route. His sentence, when it came, reflected that. Han Suja was never charged. She'd known about the forged certificates, had authorized the office access that made them possible, but had drawn a line, it turned out, at gunfire, and the law drew its own line accordingly. What she carried instead couldn't be measured in a courtroom. Rachel Adams published her investigation on the port fraud network in the 5th week. She didn't name Ngozi. That had been the condition Ngozi said 11 months before any of it happened. The story was the network, not the woman who exposed it, and Adams, who understood the difference between a source and a story, kept her word. The Terminal 4 contract survived, reduced but real, rebuilt on inspections nobody could forge a second time because Ngozi redesigned the certification chain herself, with 3 independent signatures required on every load rating from that point forward. 2 new port clients signed within a month, citing the public record as proof of exactly the kind of operation they wanted their name attached to. Han Suja moved out of the main estate in the 3rd week, into a smaller residence in a quieter district, a decision she framed to the family as practical and that everyone privately understood as something closer to penance. Hae-jun visited her there once, alone, for 90 minutes, and told Ngozi afterward only that his mother had said she was sorry and that he believed she meant it, even if he wasn't certain yet that meaning it and understanding it were the same thing. Ngozi didn't press him for more. Some conversations between a mother and her son belonged only to the 2 of them, and she had learned, over 18 months in that family, exactly which doors were hers to open and which ones weren't. Mrs. Yoon received, without asking for it, a formal title and a salary that finally matched 19 years of quietly running a household that had never once thanked her by name. When Hae-jun told her this in the kitchen doorway, she'd tried to deflect it, the way people who've spent decades being invisible often do, and he'd simply repeated it until she stopped arguing and started, for the first time Ngozi had ever seen, crying instead. And on a Thursday 6 weeks later, a demolition crew took down the wall between the Han Estate's kitchen and its dining room. Non-structural, Ngozi had confirmed it herself months before any of this began, back when she'd first noticed how strange it was that a house could be built with a wall whose only real purpose was deciding who got to sit where. If you were in her place, the plate in the pantry, the whole family watching to see if you'd fold, would you have chosen to leave, or chosen to stay and rebuild the table so nobody ever ate alone in that house again? Tell me your answer. I read every single one. The table that replaced it sat 22. Long pale oak, no head, no foot, just length enough for everyone who belonged, which by then included the housekeeper who'd told the truth when it cost her something, and the security chief who'd taken a bullet's graze without mentioning it until someone made him, and a cousin working through a debt that would take longer than a courtroom to repay. Hae-jun sat beside his wife the first night they used it, not at either end, just beside her, and when their eyes met across takeout containers because the new kitchen wasn't finished yet, he raised his glass of water, not wine, a choice she noticed and didn't need explained. I'm sorry it took a house falling apart for me to see all of it, he said quietly. You saw enough of it in time, she said. That's what mattered. Outside, the rain that had followed Busan for 11 weeks had finally stopped that afternoon, and through the new windows the harbor lights lay flat and steady on dark water, the way they do on the other side of every storm that's finally spent itself, not resolved, not finished, but standing, and long enough now for whoever needed a seat at it.